Hello and welcome. My name is John Van Etten. I'm the Managing Director of Human Synergistics office here in Germany. Welcome to our Wednesday call where we take an hour to discuss merger and acquisition projects, specifically the use of OCI and OEI and good models like the How Culture Works model to help inform merger and acquisition projects. So I've been with HS for 11 years. I've had the pleasure of being involved actually in quite a few M&As over the years. I wanted to make one distinction when we look at mergers that have already taken place versus those which are planned to take place. What we're talking about here today primarily is those that happen, we get involved with before the merger actually takes place. Oftentimes, and in fact, maybe the majority of the merger and acquisition related projects that we're involved in with respect to culture have to do with organizations that have already merged, and that is not playing out effectively either for the business or the leadership teams, and then we're asked to come in and have a look. That's actually to some extent a different thing, so and a different design. So I'll be focusing on merger and acquisitions where we get involved ideally early on and before the businesses in fact merge and come together. So how do we get involved in these projects? I thought would be useful because those questions that the client has are typically those which we build the projects upon. And those questions from the client early on are typically things that relate to cultural due diligence. So essentially questions like, are the current cultures of these organizations compatible? If they're different, in what ways are they different? And also with respect to values, which is a very nice thing to be able to answer for clients, sort of are the values of these organizations something that's compatible moving forward as a shared organization. So those are the two usually key areas the client is interested in, typically the first by and large, but we definitely try to answer both of them. And then to be honest with you, there are usually either follow-up questions or also just simply as a function of conducting OCI, OEI projects with these organizations, we're able to actually give them much more information than just answering those questions. So I wanted to go into those as well. So in our time today, so that includes things like what is the current state, regardless of the compatibility of these two cultures, what is the current state within both organizations, and what does that tell us about what's happening in each of these businesses, regardless of how they function together. Basically, is the culture where it should be in each of the independent businesses? How is that influencing the performance of the organization? And is that where each of us really want to be? The third broad question is, how do we change and develop? So I'm going to try to go over all of this very briefly. Obviously, there's a lot of detail within these large projects, but I'm just trying to give you sort of the key messages and where those relate to HS tools and HS models. Good. So broadly, it's around answering key questions for clients, and then at the end of the day, helping them to identify where the culture should move and what needs to be done. The other thing I wanted to point out before I get into the little graphic that I have for you is sort of the #1 cultural pitfall that I always very much try to avoid in merger and acquisition projects. And stress to our practitioners to do the same. And that's really designing the project in a way that encourages either organization to essentially judge the other's culture. The trick here is to help organizations to pull together in merger and acquisitions and not to send the message that, for example, one organization has the right culture and the other organization has the wrong culture, or ours is better or worse than the other organization. Those kinds of messages inherently encourage people, if you're familiar with our models, to begin seeing each other as, or the other organization as the other and the risk, and begin working sort of against those businesses, which is why you see, unfortunately, patterns in organizations that have already merged in which the cultures remain disparate and different within the business and cause all sorts of challenges. So you'll see this throughout, and I'll come back to it as we go through about trying to maintain a shared goal rather than comparing directly across both organizations. This also, by the way, has an effect on how we release report data. So for much of the time, usually in these cases, we're exclusively delivering reports and data about company A to company A and company B to company, and they're not looking at each other's reports and data. Only the consulting team and typically HS sees the whole picture, and then we can advise to help, as you'll see, move these organizations constructively forward. Okay, if that makes some sense, then I'll share my screen. So these are a couple of how culture works models. So hopefully you're familiar. If not, welcome. Happy to follow up with you after the call. So these are, if you're familiar with OCI and OEI, of course, the how culture works model, and this is actual client data. We've pulled these sort of randomly for demonstrational purposes, but this should help you to understand the points. So as you know, on the left, we have ideal culture. So company A, if you will, toward the top, company B toward the bottom. And in these organizations, we really stress using both OCI, current and ideal, as well as OEI. So that's what I'm including here today. So once we conduct these projects, then we can begin answering some of the client's questions. Typically, the first, as I mentioned already, is how compatible is the current culture? But again, to try to address the #1 pitfall I already mentioned, I try to shift the focus toward the secondary question oftentimes, which is values-based. Are the values of these organizations compatible, essentially, and similar? It's very hard to compare organizations across things like values, strategy, and mission statements. But when we measure descriptions of ideal culture, hopefully you can see my cursor, what we're describing here is what should be taking place, which is very much values driven, and why it's so easy typically to correlate and really associate the styles described in these ideal profiles with the value statements of the organizations. In any case, it gives the organizations a quantitative way to measure their values and to understand how similar or disparate they may be across these businesses. Now, again, if you're familiar with OCI and especially OCI ideal, you'll know that, of course, the ideal descriptions typically come out primarily constructive and not particularly defensive, which is what we see in both of these examples, and is pretty realistic. To be honest with you, at this point, what I would try to do and what we've succeeded in doing with many of the organizations and mergers in the past is to get these organizations' leadership teams to agree to merge this data together into one single shared profile, with the understanding that, you know, our ideals are similar enough. We primarily value the same patterns and behaviors. Then we can simply merge that into one combined ideal. And then moving forward in terms of debriefing reports and so on, that merged ideal becomes the ideal culture profile for both organizations. The second question is, of course, how disparate is the current operating culture, which you can see in this case. Oftentimes we find that there are, of course, some shared patterns and differences as well. This is some of the most useful information to the organizations early on. This tells you not only what's really taking place behaviorally in these two businesses, but where the primary differences are, how each organization's members are going to interact with the others, perceive them, and so on. So we don't have the time to get into the detail, but at this current culture level, we actually would go through and subgroup this for clients based on things like functional areas and hierarchical levels before, again, the merger takes place, so that we can identify those subcultures and teams within the business that have the most disparate cultures, and essentially those where we would expect difficulties to play out, challenges in collaboration and so on. That allows us to sort of preemptively, the consultants and the organization, to preemptively go into those parts of the organization and be honest with you, sort of prioritize those in terms of the culture development. It makes sense if you're going to pull these businesses together to focus on the parts of the organization and its sort of subcultures that are most disparate from one another and moving forward are going to sort of be forced to work together. So some of that subgrouping is very, very interesting and helpful. Once we understand the current cultures, then this helps to illustrate something to the client, and that is that neither one of these organizations is living the ideal. So both, and this is getting back to my avoiding the pitfall of deciding which of these cultures is correct. The answer ultimately, and really as described by these organizations themselves, is that neither of these cultures is correct. What we want to work toward is essentially an averaged ideal based on the OCI ideal. So this helps them to stop looking across the table at one another in terms of who is the problem or who is right and who is wrong, and rather recognize that each of us are not where we should be and where we described or have the culture that we described should be taking place. We both have things to learn, and that is a very useful message to actually encourage cross-learning and collaboration as this moves forward, but also to help everybody take part and not to fall into, again, the trap of one organization is right and the other must change to meet the initial organization. So again, a very, very good example also, if you were in my last week call around the uses of ideal descriptions, I think this is one of the most important, because without the OCI ideal here, these discussions typically do devolve into which culture is better than the other, which is not an appropriate way to even think of that. Anyway, and does not help either organization move forward and really can cause further challenges. So good use of the ideal as a goal to move towards. Again, in every case I've taken part, we find that these ideals are very much similar to the extent that the organizations, I've never had them come to the conclusion that our values are different. We do in many cases come to the conclusion that the culture is significantly different and in some ways potentially incompatible, but boy is that a good thing to know before the organizations merge, so that hopefully you can take some directive and developmental action rather than after the fact when you're sort of suffering the consequences. So what I've talked through so far is the first two questions essentially of the client, which is, are our values compatible and are our current operating cultures compatible? Now, the following questions are also useful and typically follow in these projects, which is the current, since neither one of these is necessarily the ideal culture, the next question is, how is this culture currently affecting the performance of each of these organizations? So again, helping to create the impetus or the interest in changing and developing, helping the clients to see that we're not only addressing culture so that these organizations can merge effectively, but we're developing culture to help the organizations be more effective in and of themselves. So even if the merger, for example, were not to take place, each of these organizations should also see the value in developing their cultures, not only based on the gap between the current and ideal states, but also based on the data that we're able to provide that illustrates the relationship between the current state and outcomes and performance criteria. So again, all those nice correlations in the supplemental section demonstrating, you know, how and quite clearly that the defensive styles detract from performance and well-being, and it's the constructive styles that contribute. So now you not only have good justification for these organizations to move toward their shared ideal for the purpose of the merger, but you're building a case for development in terms of broadly the value of constructive norms. The next piece is really getting into change. So once these organizations understand that our values may be compatible, but our current cultures might not, and that our current cultures are not only less constructive than they should be and more dissimilar with our merging partner than ideal, then we have a good reason for change. The other good reason for change tends to be we understand that what's currently taking place is not necessarily leading the business, contributing to performance the way that we would like. So this leads to questions around really building a case for change. Is there a need to develop these cultures? And secondarily, if yes, based on kind of what I've already discussed, where should we focus our efforts? And I think mergers and acquisitions are an especially good example of why OEI climate data is so useful. So now we're moving from, looking at current culture and how that drives outcomes and understanding gaps between currents and ideals into the real levers for change, the factors that we need to develop and address in order to change the culture. So there are a few real best practices in terms of how to look at this. The first tends to be when we look at, I'm not sure if I can zoom, yes. When we look across these organizations in detail, and again, this is even pretty high level, right? Because these are the 31 climate factors, which are then, of course, made up by several subscales of items. What you tend to find in all cases, most cases that I've looked at in OEI, is that organizations tend to have strengths and maybe developmental opportunities in certain areas of their climate. When you look at how they're doing things in terms of communication, job design, reward and recognition, goal setting, sort of leadership, these broad areas, you'll oftentimes find, and this is a good example, that you can tell this organization has recognized the importance of and has probably invested in communication. They're scoring significantly in the reports above average in their ability to communicate, upward, downward, communicate messages for learning and so on. So we have an organization that's quite effective in communication. Other areas of the climate are maybe overlooked or not quite as effectively coordinated, right? So in this case, job design potentially. So typically when we talk about culture development, then this would be an opportunity to focus on developing this organization around factors of job design. When we look at this in a merger and acquisition, though, it makes almost more sense to start comparing these factors across the organizations. And what you're basically looking for, I think, are a couple of categories. One, and in my opinion, the most important, are shared strengths. So the things that are strong in both organizations' climate. And communication to some extent is an example here. We have a shared strength in upward communication. The reason for that is the strengths within an organization's climate are the things that you want to use in order to communicate not only things like the merger, but the culture development itself. So communication is a good example. If both organizations are strong and prescriptive and facilitating in their communication strategies, then use those strategies during the culture initiative. Talk to your people about why we're doing this, what the goal of the initiative is, what their part is, how this connects to our values, how we're creating one broad business out of these two organizations. Utilize the strengths in both organizations' climate. The second priority are the weaknesses or opportunities for development. So those climate factors that are a bit negative in both organizations. In this case, use of rewards and use of punishment are unfortunately both examples. Both organizations are scoring below average on the frequency and likelihood that they give positive feedback and rewards, and they're a little too frequent in providing negative feedback and messages. So that is then potentially a development priority, something that the consulting team, internal OD, HR, leadership teams need to take on board as a priority that we can all address. Again, going back to the #1 pitfall, we don't want to start talking about what that organization is doing correctly and what we're doing wrong, for example. So rather, we'll talk about what we both have as strengths, communication, and to use that, and what we both have as opportunities. In this case, we're a little too negative and not quite as positive in our messaging and feedback as we should be. So again, you're utilizing shared strengths and addressing shared opportunities, and that helps the organizations to see that we're sort of in this together. Again, there's no right and wrong, and we'll get where we're going if we work together and learn from one another. Those kinds of positive, more constructive messages. Now, to be honest with you, that's the kind of structure that I would use and suggest to really define, not only what patterns within the culture we need to address, and again, that would be things like those which differ most significantly from our shared ideal, or those patterns that are within both organizations and most strongly detracting from performance in those businesses. Once we narrow this down to a few styles that, and again, I should have pointed this out, hopefully you're addressing the same styles in both organizations' cultures. If you're familiar with my usual recommendations, that's typically 2 styles. At least one of those styles should be a constructive style to promote, and one of those styles could be a defensive style to reduce. Just by eyeballing these, humanistic encouraging might be a constructive style they could both benefit from, and that also works nicely with potentially reducing something like oppositional behavior. So with those 2 patterns in the culture that we want to address, then we're moving back into climate, a little bit more complex than what we might typically do. Usually what we would do for one organization is, once we identify those styles, we're using correlations or whatever initiatives the organization is currently utilizing to identify the factors that we need to address for development. When you get into merger and acquisitions, then I think it's almost more useful to compare across the climates of these businesses and prioritize the climate factors, as I kind of outlined before, around the shared strengths and shared opportunities, and focus on those shared opportunities and really push this strongly. It needs to be, and now we're getting sort of outside of maybe HS's immediate role, but as we communicate this as leadership teams, we need to be very clear and consistent on both sides of the organization around what we're moving toward, and again, driving the business forward through good strategies and implementation of climate and leadership impact, for example. Going back to one other point, though, in any case, so this gives you a structure for prioritizing. So we would suggest, of course, that kind of a development initiative would be implemented for something like 12 to 18 months. So again, in my experience, it's a challenge to get ahead of these mergers that far in order to have time to really shift the cultures of these businesses before the merger, which is why, as I mentioned before, subgrouping becomes very useful, because if we can't shift the culture of the entire organization before the merger happens, then at least we can identify the subgroups and sort of areas of the business where the current operating cultures are most disparate and focus some targeted development there. Last point I wanted to make, I'm ahead of time, was that this is really talking about how we structure and prioritize this information for the client up until the initial development of, as I just said, 12 to 18 months. The next development round or cycle, if you will, hopefully at that point they would do a progress check where we would remeasure, then understand where we are currently in terms of the culture, how much more constructively each of these organizations has become. Of course, in that kind of data, we can also understand what specifically within the climate has changed. So are our efforts really paying off? And by the way, we can also do pulse tests along the way every quarter, for example, to see if the areas we're focusing on, for example, using more positive feedback and rewards and less punishment and criticism, is actually taking place, and before we see it appear in the culture. So using good pulsing and a progress check to make sure that this change is happening and that the efforts we're putting in are paying off. And then once we get that progress check, again, we're talking 12, 18 months, we're probably into the merger at this point, then in my experience, you can start to focus on the next area of climate, which are those things that are a strength in one organization's climate, but are a weakness or an opportunity in the other organization. Again, I don't think we should focus on these things too early on, because it can send the message that this organization is doing this correctly or better than the other organization, and that's not usually, again, a great message in the early stages of these mergers. But assuming we've gotten ahead of this and the merger has progressed and we see more constructive norms when we do a progress check, then a very good practice, if we're at that sort of level of comfort, is to find those, again, greatest strengths in organization A that were the greatest opportunities in organization B, and vice versa, and address a few of them at the same time. And that way we can sort of learn from each organization the strengths of each other to build toward that more constructive, more highly performing, more effectively merged business. So I hope that helps. We're about at 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop and take questions here in a second. But again, with the understanding of our How Culture Works models and what OCI and OEI do, I think it's really interesting to take a look at, one deeper step in complexity and how useful not only these models are to understand what's going on within an organization, but if we're merging two different businesses together, understanding at a real fundamental level and in a way that I don't really think you can capture easily or accurately in any other way, where are our shared strengths? What is going to seem similar across these businesses? What is going to seem most disparate? Where are we going to struggle? How is that going to play out? Where is that going to play out? What can we do to change it? Where do we all want to go? I mean, these are some pretty big questions for leadership teams and organizations, and it's nice to be able to try to answer those questions with good data, reliable models, and see that pay off in their projects. Okay, I hope that made some sense. Let me stop here and see what input questions you may have. Yeah, in our models, the ones I was just showing, business strategy is typically an outcome or it follows upon values of the organization. So thinking about both things like what the ideal culture is, how people should behave in this business, and secondly, what the purpose of the organization ultimately is. Based on that, typically then strategy would be developed in terms of how do we effectively behave in those ways in an attempt to fulfill that purpose. When people go through the training in our tools, this is something that we talk about in some detail around societal values, and specifically, again, with reference to Hofstede and how that plays out in our models. The short story is that, yes, there are differences across societies in terms of what they describe as being appropriate and ideal in terms of how we behave. But based on our models, those differences are very secondary to overwhelming shared consistency. So what we find in that shortest way I can put it is, the constructive styles at the top of the model that help to fulfill and higher order psychological satisfaction oriented needs in people are valued everywhere in the world by all societies to a very great extent. Creativity, hard work, being interested in other people, sharing information, collaborating are broadly shared values that map to our model. Differences tend to be in things like, power distance is a very good one. And those differences do show up in our models, but as very slight differences. So in many cases with multinational organizations, I encourage that they ask their leaders across the entire business or more broadly, what should be going on. And while they'll find differences if they subgroup that by country and by regions, which is fascinating, yeah, you'll find differences. But what you find is, you know, by and large, 80 to 90% of that profile is shared. And then they agree to just merge that all together into one company-wide global ideal that includes everyone's perspectives. And then we try to compare the current state of business to that and to help them develop into that direction. So, and if you use this more broadly, you know, hierarchies and so on, it have very little difference. People consistently describe those inherent patterns as being most ideal and appropriate. And that gives us a very good foundation and ground to stand on because it's not HS telling people from a research perspective what patterns work. They're describing it accurately for themselves with some slight social values bias, but fair enough. I'll tell you a short one. Some of them were, but it's maybe not that colorful, but it's a good. We should come back. One of the merger and acquisition projects that we sold, I'll never forget kind of how we sold it. We went to meet with the accredited consultants. They brought me in to meet with the boards of both organizations. And they had been working on the plan to merge. This was pre-merger for some time, and the boards had a little bit of contact with one another. So what we did was we used OCI Ideal. We asked the board members before the meeting to, I'm sorry, OCI Current. We asked the board members of each organization to describe the current culture of their business. And it was like 10, 15 members on each side. We then scored those profiles, came into the organization, talked through, you know, from the consulting perspective, and then really introduced the methodology and the tools that set our project apart. In any case, we very briefly introduced this model and then simply put both profiles up on a PowerPoint without indicating whose profile was whose. And it was really interesting because immediately both leadership teams in the room were able to identify which of those profiles was us and which was them. And even though the profiles weren't that different, they were immediately able to not only recognize that that's how we work together, but the differences across. And that was useful for them because they realized that, you know, if we as a board with all of the benefits for this merger, still are able to perceive the others as the others so easily and fall into that, what's going to happen when we really try to pull these businesses together broadly? And isn't it useful to be able to predict how that's going to happen if you can really understand the culture? I think that really opened their eyes to the value of this kind of measurement. It's fun stuff. It's a good place to apply, you know, things like culture measurement and models to take out the mystery and unclarity, of course, that is at the root of many of these issues. The first thing I should point out is that HS typically broadly does not conduct consulting services. So we're usually working through, and in all of the merger and acquisitions I'm thinking of and referring to, we were working through accredited consultants and consulting teams and businesses who were really servicing the client directly. So HS is sort of behind the scenes providing the tools, the data, the reports upon which they then prioritize and really engage with the client and conduct leadership development and the internal, you know, the real implementation stages. Having said that, we definitely are hoping to be in contact as high in the organization as we can possibly be. I mean, for a variety of reasons. Not only, you know, is leadership so key in terms of creating any real sustainable change, but I mean, that's really the level of the organization that has to be engaged in the messaging of the merger. For anything to happen successfully. And then we're typically trying to cascade that down through the business as quickly as we can, you know, to initiate this. So connecting with, aligning with senior leaders, a lot of times that has to do with ideals and value statements around where the business is going. And then again, measuring the culture, comparing the primary gaps, prioritizing and developing. It definitely requires typically HR, OD departments, as well as in many cases, an additional sort of network of, call them what you will, culture champions, advocates, people within the business who have some additional potentially training on these models and can sort of debrief and understand reports for their part of the business, translate and prioritize initiatives. So we typically try to cascade this. The real trap is getting involved only at the management level. You're only connected with HR or OD, and you really don't have direct access to leadership. It doesn't bode well in the long run for that development. Well, yes. I mean, that's actually the beautiful sort of synergy, if you will, of this whole model, because if we're recognizing that in the case I showed, neither organization is living the culture that they described should be taking place, then we're really working to develop both businesses in a coordinated way toward that ideal. Now, that ideal is more constructive, and therefore we can predict and prove it's going to lead to more high performance, sort of, again, regardless of the criteria we're looking at. Again, we measure stress, satisfaction, engagement, ability of teams and units to function internally and across, the ability of the organization to adapt, quality of service, and so on and so forth. And of course, we build in custom performance criteria, innovative thinking, adaptability, you name it. And those things consistently are positively related to constructive norms and negatively related to defensive. So the point is that at the end of the day, we're talking to both of these organizations about developing more constructive norms. That is doing three main things. One, it's making each organization more highly performing. Two, it's making each organization more similar to their values. So we are beginning to walk the talk. And thirdly, it's making both organizations more similar to one another, because we're both becoming less aggressive, more constructive, thereby more collaborative, and really the things you need not only to perform independently, but to pull the businesses together in a coordinated way. So it's a very elegant solution. You're giving them one goal to move toward to really address the issues, not only the gaps in our culture that are causing the problems in our business and are preventing us from being where we want to be, but those gaps also represent typically the differences between our businesses. And thereby creating a more shared culture that is able to pull together rather than clash. And by the way, if you deal with organizations that have already merged, which we do far more frequently, as was alluded, it is rare to get involved this early on, and only happens, I didn't answer that, when we're involved with senior leadership teams and boards and consultants who get involved very early on in the projects. But if you don't, and you're dealing with an organization that has already merged and has culture issues potentially or challenges, please let us know that. It's a fascinating demographic to build in. We will simply ask the people essentially, were you with this organization 2 years ago or more? If yes, which of these previous businesses were you a member of? And then you can actually simply subgroup the data that way. And it's amazing. In many cases, you'll see radically different cultures, subcultures. When the overall profile, well, for those of you who know our tools, you'll have small, wide standard deviations, large standard, a lot of variance. And then you subgroup based on which organization were you formerly with. And you get two distinct profiles that are different from one another, and the standard deviations become very narrow. All of a sudden, there's two consistent subcultures within the business that you don't really see when they're average. So it's interesting to be able to subgroup those things and look at whether those patterns of culture are continuing to tick on. And those differences, I mean, there's two things you don't want in your culture at the end of the day, right? Defensive norms and differences. You don't want, this part of the business functioning in incompatible ways with another part of the business. Then thank you very much for being here. It was nice to have a chance to talk about merger and acquisition projects. Always fun and exciting. So if you have any topics, questions, happy to follow up with you. Thank you for joining, and hope to see you next Wednesday again on another topic.